Before microwaves hummed and ovens glowed with their steady light, there was a quieter way to cook, one that relied not on electricity or gas, but on patience, insulation, and trust. Hidden deep within the cookbooks of 1950s America are recipes that defy what we think of as cooking. They required no flame, no heat source, and sometimes no kitchen at all. They belonged to a nearly forgotten world of fireless cooking. At first glance, these recipes, haybox stews, milk bottle puddings, thermos soups, might sound like survival tricks or relics of wartime thrift. But in truth, they reveal something far more intimate: the spirit of an era that believed progress and simplicity could coexist. Fireless cooking was born out of frugality and necessity, but by the 1950s it had become something different, a symbol of ingenuity, patience, and quiet pride in the American home. Postwar homemakers were surrounded by the promise of modernity. Shiny chrome ovens, prepackaged cake mixes, and electric timers filled department store displays. Yet, many of those same women still turned to methods that required no fire at all. In part, it was habit, a carryover from the Great Depression and the war years when every scrap of fuel and food mattered. But it was also philosophy. These women understood that time could be a tool as powerful as heat. Flip through a mid-century community cookbook and you'll find the clues: fireless custard, no heat lemon sponge, haybox baked beans. Each one tells a story of quiet resilience. They were dishes that simmered while children were sent off to school, that stayed warm through Sunday service, that waited for fathers returning from factory shifts, meals that asked for nothing but trust, and in return, delivered warmth when it was needed most. Fireless cooking thrived because it embodied a rare kind of wisdom. It wasn't about gadgets or convenience. It was about rhythm and care. To make a fireless dish was to plan ahead, to think of your family hours before they sat at the table. It was a domestic art rooted in time, not speed, a reminder that progress didn't always mean haste. And though the movement faded with the arrival of microwaves, prepackaged meals, and the glitter of modern efficiency, the lessons it left behind are timeless. These recipes weren't just culinary curiosities. They were reflections of a nation learning how to live again after hardship, one quiet, heatless meal at a time. This is the story of vintage fireless cooking recipes hidden inside 1950s cookbooks, a look back at the ingenuity that kept America's kitchens running even when the fires went out. 1. The forgotten art of fireless cooking. You probably never thought a pot could cook dinner without a single flame. But in the kitchens of post-war America, it wasn't science fiction. It was called fireless cooking. And for a brief, curious moment, it felt like the future. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, American homemakers were balancing progress with practicality. Gas was expensive, electricity unreliable in rural towns, and the scars of wartime rationing still lingered. Cookbooks of the era, tucked between glossy advertisements for canned pineapple and Jell-O molds, offered something quietly radical: recipes that required no active heat. These weren't raw meals or salads. They were stews, puddings, and casseroles, comforting, hearty dishes prepared the night before, then left to cook slowly inside insulated boxes, hay-filled tins, or even wrapped in old quilts. The idea was simple: trap heat inside and let time finish the job. It was efficiency wrapped in ingenuity. To mid-century homemakers, this wasn't just about saving money or time. It was about mastery. The fireless cooker represented a kind of quiet power, a way to feed a family while tending to children, sewing, or running errands. It meant dinner could cook itself while life went on. By the 1950s, women's magazines began to frame it as a symbol of modern womanhood. The kitchen wasn't a smoky battlefield anymore. It was a laboratory of clean design and clever thinking. Homemakers became domestic scientists, testing recipes that blurred the line between tradition and technology. But beneath that polished image, fireless cooking carried emotional weight. It came from a generation that had endured the Great Depression and World War II, People who had learned that nothing should be wasted, not time, not fuel, not warmth. These recipes weren't just clever, they were born from survival. And yet, this innovation didn't last. Within a decade, electric ovens and convenience foods swept through American kitchens. What once seemed revolutionary was suddenly quaint. Fireless cookers ended up in attics and thrift shops, their instruction booklets fading alongside forgotten homemaking skills. Still, hidden inside old 1950s cookbooks, the ghost of that movement lingers. Between recipes for aspics and molded salads, you can find instructions for insulated casseroles and haybox stews, traces of a time when patience and practicality defined progress. In the end, the art of fireless cooking wasn't about saving energy. It was about saving effort, reclaiming peace in a post-war world that moved faster every year. Number 2, the mystery of the haybox oven. Imagine a pot of stew still bubbling hours after you've left the kitchen without a single spark or flame. And that was the quiet magic of the haybox oven, one of the strangest and most ingenious cooking tools of the early 20th century that found a second life in the kitchens of 1950s America. Long before slow cookers hummed on countertops, the haybox was a box, literally filled with hay, straw, or even wool scraps. A homemaker would bring her stew, soup, or porridge just to a boil on the stove, then nestle the hot pot deep into the box, wrapping it tightly. The trapped heat kept cooking the food for hours. It was simple physics wrapped in rural practicality. But by the mid-century, this simple method had taken on a nostalgic charm. The post-war 1950s were obsessed with both innovation and memory. Homemakers leafing through cookbooks found fireless cooker recipes that traced back to their grandmothers, hearty bean stews, brown bread puddings, and oatmeal left to simmer overnight in makeshift hayboxes. They were glimpses of a quieter, thriftier America, rediscovered in a new atomic age. For many women, the haybox wasn't just an oddity from the past. It was an ally. It freed them from standing over the stove, letting them tend to children or chores, while dinner gently transformed in silence. In community cookbooks, you'd sometimes find proud notes scribbled in the margins, still warm after 6 hours, or tastes even better the next morning. In rural towns where electricity was spotty and coal expensive, hayboxes were both old-fashioned and quietly revolutionary. Some homemakers even turned their car trunks into insulated cookers, driving to church socials with casseroles that had cooked themselves along the way. Yet there was something emotional about it too. The haybox was rooted in a kind of patience that the modern world was quickly losing. Cooking without fire required faith. You couldn't peek or stir. You had to trust the process. For women who'd survived ration books and blackouts, that patience was almost second nature. By the late 1950s, though, the haybox began to feel like an artifact. The era of shiny chrome ovens and convenience foods had arrived. Why wrap a pot in hay when a new electric cooker promised precision in minutes? Still, the haybox never truly disappeared. It evolved. The slow cooker, patented in the 1940s and popularized decades later, borrowed its principle: low heat, long patience, sealed flavor. Every time a crock-pot hums quietly on a kitchen counter, it's echoing a century-old trick born in barns and basements. The haybox oven might have vanished from cookbooks, but it left behind an idea that still defines comfort food today: cooking that waits for you, not the other way around. Hashtag 3. War-era leftovers turned 1950s luxury. The story of American cooking after World War II is one of transformation, of turning thrift into pride. In those early 1950s kitchens, the spirit of wartime resourcefulness hadn't vanished. It had simply put on pearls and a smile. And nowhere was that clearer than in the rise of fireless luxury, where yesterday's frugality was rebranded as tomorrow's elegance. During the war, ration books ruled the pantry. Meat was scarce, butter was precious, and fuel was never guaranteed. Housewives learned to make do, stretching stews with oats, baking with powdered eggs, and finding clever ways to save energy. Fireless cooking fit that world perfectly. A pot that could finish cooking off heat was not just convenient, it was patriotic. But when peace returned, everything changed. Prosperity brought new appliances and magazines like Good Housekeeping and Ladies Got Hack. Home Journal began reframing those same survival tricks as part of a modern woman's charm. Recipes that had once been born of necessity, like fireless rice puddings or cold set chicken salads, were now dressed up with bright garnishes, crystal dishes, and words like continental and elegant. Cookbook editors were subtle about it. They didn't remind readers of the shortages or sacrifices that had created these ideas. Instead, they presented them as clever time savers for the busy suburban hostess. "Dinner cooks while you're out," read one 1952 headline above a recipe that, just a decade earlier, would have been labeled wartime economy. In a way, these recipes captured a deep emotional contradiction of the 1950s. America was moving into an age of abundance, but it was haunted by the memory of scarcity. Fireless cooking stood at that crossroads. It allowed homemakers to celebrate progress while holding on to the lessons that had kept families fed through darker years. Behind the glamour shots of gelatin-coated entrees and chilled desserts, there was something almost wistful. Women who had once rationed sugar were now serving no-heat custards in glass dishes, not because they had to, but because they could. The skill, the ingenuity, the quiet pride of making something out of nothing remained. And yet, that balance couldn't last. As convenience foods and frozen dinners flooded the market, the art of no-fire cooking started to feel dated. The phrase itself disappeared from cookbooks, replaced by buzzier words like speed and efficiency. Still, if you open an old binder from the 1950s, you'll find traces of it: a fireless fudge, a cold-set meat terrine, a leftover stew transformed into continental casserole. They're not just recipes, they're proof of how America turned endurance into elegance for the milk bottle miracle. Before blenders whirred and microwaves hummed, there was the humble glass milk bottle, a quiet hero of the 1950s kitchen. To most, it was a simple delivery vessel, left on the doorstep by the milkman. But to clever homemakers, it was something more: a stoveless tool that could cook breakfast and dessert overnight. The idea began out of practicality. Those thick glass bottles, built to survive countless refills, held heat remarkably well. A homemaker could pour hot milk and grains, say oats or rice, into one, seal it tight, wrap it in a towel, and leave it on the counter or inside a wool-lined box. By morning, the contents had thickened into a soft, creamy pudding. No flame, no pot, no stirring. Just trapped warmth and patience. In postwar America, where mornings moved fast and kitchen gadgets were multiplying, this trick felt almost magical. Cookbook writers leaned into it, printing recipes for milk bottle oatmeal, fireless rice custard, and even breakfast in a bottle. Mothers could prepare them at night, knowing their families would wake to a warm, ready meal. It wasn't just about convenience, it was about confidence. Fireless recipes like this promised freedom from the kitchen without guilt. Women could keep a tidy home and still serve something that felt homemade and nourishing. In a decade that prized domestic perfection, the milk bottle trick was a quiet victory. Magazines even romanticized it. Photos showed smiling mothers pouring thick oatmeal into glass bowls, sunlight glinting through the bottle. The ads hinted at science, but sold nostalgia, a connection to the simple, unhurried cooking of their mothers and grandmothers. It was a bridge between eras, old-fashioned thrift dressed up as modern innovation. But perhaps the real charm of the milk bottle miracle was emotional. It made cooking feel effortless and resourceful, a reminder that a good meal didn't always need fire or fuss. Families would wake to the smell of sweet milk and cinnamon, proof that comfort could be coaxed from the simplest things. Of course, as new appliances arrived, the electric percolator, the instant oatmeal packet, the trick faded. By the 1960s, no one was pouring boiling milk into bottles anymore. The practice lingered only in old homemaking manuals, often scribbled with notes like, "Still warm in the morning," or "Don't forget to use a towel for insulation." Those faded recipes speak to a lost rhythm of life, one where the night worked quietly while families slept and breakfast arrived through patience, not power. Page 5. Thermos lunches for factory fathers. In the 1950s, before microwaves and break room vending machines, lunch often traveled from home in a dented metal box and a sturdy glass thermos. Inside wasn't just soup, it was a piece of the morning, carefully packed by someone waiting for evening. And behind that simple ritual was an entire chapter of American ingenuity, the art of stoveless, heat-holding meals. The thermos was more than a container. It was a promise. With its double-walled vacuum design, it could keep soup or stew piping hot for hours, long after it left the kitchen. For thousands of working men clocking into factories, rail yards, and construction sites, that mattered. A hot meal meant comfort, consistency, and care, even on the coldest days. Women's cookbooks of the era were full of thermos recipes. They weren't just about saving time, they were about maintaining a human connection. Recipes like Fireless pea soup or all-day chili were designed to cook partially in the morning and finish slowly inside the thermos, using the same principle as the haybox: retained heat and patience. Mothers and wives knew exactly how to do it. Bring the soup to a boil, pour it into the thermos, wrap it in a towel, and send it off with a slice of bread or pie. By noon, the meal would still be warm, rich, and ready. In a way, the thermos extended the kitchen's reach. It was domestic warmth made portable. The emotional weight of that ritual ran deep. For many families, that hot lunch represented stability in uncertain times. It was a small rebellion against the industrial coldness of postwar life, a reminder that someone still cared enough to plan ahead, to make food the old way, without relying on diners or prepackaged meals. Some factories even encouraged the practice. Lunch breaks were short, and workers preferred a home-cooked meal over canteen fare. A good thermos could turn a quick 20-minute pause into a moment of comfort. The smell of stew or chowder often filled locker rooms, blending into the rhythm of the day. But as the years passed, America's work culture shifted. Cafeterias expanded, convenience replaced care, and the idea of fireless food began to sound old-fashioned. The thermos lunch faded into nostalgia, replaced by vending machine sandwiches and reheated coffee. Yet, open a 1950s cookbook, and you'll still find those quiet recipes, ones written in precise, practical language, full of trust in both time and heat. Bring to a simmer, seal tightly, serve 6 hours later. Those words captured more than a cooking method. They captured an era when food carried love across distance, when patience had flavor, and when even a steel lunchbox could hold a piece of home. Number 6. The Housewife Science Project. Step into a 1950s kitchen, and you might think you've entered a laboratory. Chrome appliances gleamed like instruments. Measuring cups were lined up like beakers. And in the middle of it all stood the homemaker, part cook, part scientist, testing recipes that promised precision, cleanliness, and a new kind of modern pride. Fireless cooking fit that spirit perfectly. To many women, it wasn't just a convenience. It was a domestic experiment in control and innovation. The post-war years were flooded with talk of scientific homemaking, a movement that urged women to adopt efficiency, data, and experimentation in their kitchens. Magazines praised them as domestic engineers, running homes as smoothly as factories. Inside those same magazines, you could find fireless cooking guides that read more like chemistry sets than recipes. Exact heat levels, insulation materials, and time-lapse reactions describing how a stew would continue to cook hours after the heat source was gone. There was something empowering in it, proof that a homemaker's intelligence could live in formulas and thermodynamics as much as in seasoning and taste. Government pamphlets encouraged this mindset too. During wartime, the Office of Home Economics had promoted energy-saving cook methods. By the 1950s, those same lessons were reframed for peace. Cook smarter, not harder. The fireless cooker became a model of scientific efficiency, a symbol of a woman's ability to merge tradition with modern progress. But there was something tender behind all the charts and checklists. Many of these women had grown up in lean times. They'd seen scarcity, rationing, and the constant balancing act of doing more with less. To them, this science wasn't about cold precision. It was about reassurance. Knowing that a meal could stay hot for hours meant security, predictability, a quiet confidence that home was in good order. One homemaker from an Iowa newsletter wrote, "It feels like cheating time itself. Dinner is waiting before I even start." That line captured what fireless cooking truly meant, not just innovation, but freedom. Still, as technology advanced, the sense of wonder faded. By the early 1960s, new electric stoves, toasters, and timed ovens promised automation without the haybox or the insulated box. The kitchen chemistry gave way to convenience. Recipes turned from experiments into instructions again. And yet, flipping through those old cookbooks today, you can still feel that curiosity between the lines. A generation of women who believed the kitchen could be a place of invention, not limitation. Tar 7. A church cookbook revolution. If you want to know what really fed small-town America in the 1950s, don't look to the glossy magazines. Look to the spiral-bound church cookbooks, those humble collections of typed pages, grease stains, and handwritten notes that passed from one kitchen to another like family heirlooms. Inside those pages, fireless cooking quietly lived on. These weren't laboratory experiments anymore. They were practical at shared solutions to everyday problems. Rural communities where electricity could still flicker out during storms or long winters relied on recipes that didn't need constant heat. Church socials, fundraisers, and community dinners all depended on food that could travel, stay warm, and feed a crowd safely. You'd find entries like Mrs. Caldwell's haybox beef, fireless baked beans, or no flame lemon custard. Each had its own little story, a margin note, a correction, sometimes even a scrawled, "works every time." The charm of these cookbooks wasn't just the food, it was the living record of women teaching one another how to stretch time, fuel, and ingredients without ever saying a word about hardship. Church kitchens became laboratories of their own kind. Casseroles were assembled at dawn and tucked into insulated carriers lined with towels or newspaper. By the time the noon bell rang, the food was still hot and ready to serve. Potluck tables filled with no-fire dishes, creamy rice puddings, meatloaves cooked by retained heat, fruit cobblers that had finished themselves while their makers were still in Sunday service. What made these recipes powerful wasn't their novelty, it was their community. Each dish carried a lineage of shared trust. A woman could flip open a church cookbook and know that what she read had worked for someone she knew, maybe a neighbor who had lost her husband, or a friend juggling 3 kids in a farm. Fireless recipes fit perfectly into that rhythm of mutual help. Even as television brought shiny new kitchen gadgets into suburban homes, the church cookbook held steady, passing down wisdom from an older America. It didn't chase trends, it preserved them. By the end of the decade, though, those no-fire recipes began to fade from newer editions. Convenience had become the new gospel, and insulated casseroles were replaced by quick-bake boxes and pre-mixed desserts. But the spirit remained. The notes in the margins, the underlined instructions, the names written beside each dish, those kept the memory of a time when cooking was a shared act of patience and trust. The next time you find one of those old books at a yard sale or thrift store, flip through it carefully. You're not just holding recipes. You're holding a quiet record of how American women once kept both food and faith warm without a single flame. Number 8. The Lost Lemon Sponge Cake. Some recipes disappear because they were failures. Others vanished because they worked too well and the world moved on. The lemon sponge cake of the 1950s belonged to the latter kind, a bright, airy dessert that set without a single spark of heat. For a short time, it was the darling of mid-century homemakers, a triumph of chemistry and charm. Then it quietly slipped into obscurity. The magic ingredient was gelatin. In the 1950s, gelatin was everywhere, sitting at the crossroads of science and homemaking pride. Food companies marketed it as the modern cook's miracle, proof that the kitchen had entered the age of precision. Recipes boasted of fireless pies, puddings, and mousses that could hold their shape without baking. The lemon sponge cake was the crown jewel of that movement. To make it, women would whip egg whites and sugar into peaks, dissolve gelatin into lemon juice and milk, then fold everything together. The mixture was poured into a mold, chilled overnight, and by morning it had set into a pale, cloud-like cake. Light, tangy, and surprisingly firm, it felt like dessert born of both patience and progress. The appeal was more than taste, it was symbolism. For women who had spent their youth stirring pots over coal stoves, this dessert represented modern freedom. You didn't need an oven. You didn't even need to watch it. You prepared it once, and time did the rest. It was homemaking without sweat, a touch of luxury earned through ingenuity. Mid-century cookbooks treated it like a small revolution. Phrases like no heat elegance and refrigerated perfection made their way into recipe titles. Photographs showed the dessert glistening on crystal plates, a yellow halo in pastel kitchens. It was a dessert that seemed to belong to the future, bright, clean, and effortless. But time is a strange critic. As the 1960s rolled in, gelatin itself fell victim to overexposure. It crept into everything, meats, salads, even vegetables, and the magic turned into mockery. Fireless desserts like the lemon sponge cake began to feel dated, symbols of an over-engineered kitchen that had lost touch with warmth. And so, the recipe faded. It lingered only in community cookbooks and old index cards, often smudged and handwritten, sometimes missing key steps. Many home bakers today have never heard of it. Yet, for a brief moment in the 1950s, that no-bake sponge cake captured the essence of an age, an era that believed science could make life sweeter, simpler, and just a little more perfect. If you ever come across one of those old recipes, don't be surprised if it still works. The ingredients haven't changed, just the patience to wait for something to set overnight. Now start 9. From war nurses to suburban moms. The story of fireless cooking didn't start in shiny 1950s kitchens. It started on the front lines. During both world wars, field nurses and relief workers learned to cook without open flames. It wasn't a culinary trend back then. It was survival. And when peace returned, those same women carried those lessons home, transforming wartime ingenuity into the quiet comfort of suburban kitchens. During the First and Second World Wars, conserving fuel was more than a suggestion. It was a duty. The U.S. government urged women to save coal, wood, and gas for the troops. Pamphlets showed them how to build makeshift haybox cookers out of crates and blankets. Nurses in field hospitals used the same idea to prepare broths and porridges for soldiers when fires were unsafe or supplies low. A single pot could simmer for hours inside an insulated box, feeding dozens without wasting a single flame. When the wars ended, many of those same women found themselves in a new kind of battlefield, the growing suburbs of the 1950s. The skills they had learned out of necessity now became tools of pride and convenience. Fireless cooking, once tied to hardship, became a mark of cleverness and care. A mother could prepare dinner early, wrap it in towels, and find it ready by evening. No constant tending, no risk of burning. Cookbooks of the time reflected this shift. Recipes that had once been buried in government leaflets now appeared in glossy spreads under names like all-day ham loaf or overnight oat delight. The tone had changed, but the principle remained the same. Start with heat, then let time and insulation do the rest. There was something tender in that transformation, Fireless recipes were a bridge between two Americas, the one that had endured scarcity and the one that was learning abundance. Women who had rationed flour and reused coffee tins now filled their kitchens with chrome appliances, yet many kept their old, frugal habits. They didn't just want to cook fast, they wanted to cook smart. In the quiet of those new ranch houses, the lessons of wartime endurance found a second life. What had once been a symbol of sacrifice became a symbol of stability. It was as if every pot that stayed warm beneath a quilt carried a silent echo of the past, proof that peace had not erased resilience. Today, few remember that connection. Fireless cookers are often seen as novelties, not relics of a world where women invented safety, warmth, and nourishment under impossible conditions. But behind every suburban recipe for no-heat pudding or insulated stew lies that deeper lineage, born from nurses, soldiers, and mothers who learned that sometimes the best meals are the ones that take their time. 10. Mason jars as mini ovens. Before microwaves and air fryers promised instant everything, there was a quieter kind of kitchen magic, one built from thrift, patience, and a few mason jars. In 1950s America, homemakers discovered that those sturdy glass containers, once meant for canning, could do far more than preserve summer fruit. They could, with a bit of ingenuity, bake without an oven at all. It started as a wartime trick and lingered through the decade as a badge of resourcefulness. The idea was simple. Fill mason jars with batter or custard, screw the lids loosely, and place them in a pot of boiling water or a towel-lined cooler filled with heat-retaining stones. Hours later, the contents would emerge firm, fragrant, and fully baked. Some cooks even used the back seat of a parked car or a closed cupboard as an improvised incubator on hot days. It sounds implausible today, but in mid-century kitchens, this method worked. Recipes for jar cakes, cup custards, and fireless puddings began to appear in regional cookbooks. They were the ideal compromise, safe, efficient, and easy to transport to church picnics or community suppers. The sealed jars trapped warmth, steam, and flavor, turning modest ingredients into comfort food. There was also a kind of quiet pride in these experiments. The 1950s homemaker was often portrayed as neat and composed, but behind that image was real inventiveness. She didn't just follow recipes, she adapted them. A jar on a windowsill could finish cooking in the sun. A cake wrapped in towels could set on its own. It was part domestic science, part maternal intuition. And it wasn't just practicality. There was emotional satisfaction in seeing those jars lined up on a counter, small, shining symbols of order and care. A mother could fill them at night and wake to the sweet, homey scent of spice cake or custard, proof that patience still had a place in a fast-changing world. By the late 1950s, as electric ovens became more affordable and Tupperware began replacing glass jars, this method faded quietly into nostalgia. But the memory lingered. A few of those recipes survived in family collections, often labeled with affectionate notes like Grandma's jar cakes, made without turning on the stove. Today, when people rediscover those handwritten directions, there's a kind of disbelief. This worked, but it did. It worked because the principle was sound, and the people who used it trusted in the slow alchemy of heat and time. For mid-century homemakers, those jars weren't just containers. They were proof that creativity could fill in wherever technology hadn't yet reached. By the early 1960s, the hum of electricity replaced the silence of insulated pots. The hayboxes were gone, the thermoses turned to lunchroom relics, and the phrase "fireless cooking" disappeared from magazines and homemaking manuals. America had embraced convenience, and with it, a faster rhythm of life. But what was lost wasn't just a method of cooking, it was a mindset. The recipes tucked away in those mid-century cookbooks remind us that patience once had a place in the kitchen. Food wasn't just about efficiency or presentation. It was about endurance, adaptation, and love expressed through time. A pot that cooked itself under a blanket wasn't a shortcut. It was a gesture of care. It spoke to a way of living that found satisfaction in preparation rather than performance. Today, when people rediscover these fireless recipes, they're often treated as novelties, but they carry echoes of something deeper. They belong to an America that knew how to balance innovation with simplicity, a culture that trusted its own hands more than its appliances. Every no heat pudding, every slow simmering haybox stew was a quiet act of faith in the power of patience. In a modern world obsessed with instant results, fireless cooking feels almost radical. It asks us to slow down, to let the hours do the work, to remember that some of the best meals are the ones we don't rush. These forgotten recipes, born in war, perfected in peace, and lost in progress, still have something to teach us about what it means to create warmth without fire. The women who mastered this craft didn't just feed their families, they redefined what it meant to nurture. They proved that even without heat, a kitchen could still glow. And in that quiet glow lives the memory of a nation that once believed in the slow miracle of time, turning simple ingredients and simple faith into something extraordinary.